What if the government can permanently strip you of your Second Amendment rights, not because you were caught committing any violent act, but simply because you're engaged in an activity that the federal government does not like? That's exactly the question at the center of a critical new Second Amendment case that will be ruled on by the Supreme Court this year. This Second Amendment case has broad-reaching implications for the Second Amendment going forward, so let's talk about what is happening in this critical challenge. Now, before we jump into this video, if you guys want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to subscribe. Also, double check to make sure YouTube has not unsubscribed you. And I also want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is First Form. You guys know that First Form is an amazing company. They're pro-freedom, pro-America. They support the Second Amendment and what we talk about here on the channel. So if you're interested, if you want to get healthier, maybe you have a New Year's resolution, check them out using the link down below. And if you use that link and you order any supplements, they will also give you a free 5-pack of protein sticks. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be discussing a critical Second Amendment challenge that was recently granted review by the Supreme Court and will be ruled on this term. This case seeks to force the Supreme Court to determine who are the people mentioned in the text of the Second Amendment. Now, this case revolves around 18 U.S.C. section 922G3 and its restrictions on the unlawful use of controlled substances and if individuals using those controlled substances actually fall outside of the 2A's protections. The question is, does the Constitution protect only the so-called law-abiding responsible citizens as defined by the federal government, or does it apply to all people unless there is clear proof of that individual being a danger? This case, U.S. versus Hamani, now pushes the Supreme Court to answer that very question. And recently, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals threw the challenge out and threw a charge out against an individual, Mr. Hamani, saying that under its own precedent, the law can't be applied to someone who was not actively intoxicated at the time that they possessed a gun. This case has now made its way all the way to the Supreme Court, and now the Supreme Court has granted review to this challenge and will rule on this case this term. This creates another significant 2A case that can shape the landscape of 2A cases going forward. And now the Trump administration has submitted their response and their arguments to this case, and they continue to argue that the Supreme Court should uphold this federal law. So who was Mr. Hamani and how did this case wind up in the Supreme Court? Well, from the outset, I will state that Mr. Hamani does not seem like a great person. And factually, he is not a good individual, not a good plaintiff, and it causes a lot of issues for this case. These are typically the type of factual cases and plaintiffs that the federal government likes to push to the Supreme Court because it helps them to get the ruling that they want. Now, Mr. Hamani is a dual citizen of the United States and Pakistan, and his actions actually drew the attention of the FBI. So in 2019, a search of his phone at a border crossing uncovered communications suggesting that maybe he was prepared to commit some fraud on behalf of people maybe tied to Iran and then other extremist groups as well. Now, Mr. Hamani kept close ties with Iran as well, including contact with his brother who attended a university in that country. However, Mr. Hamani's problems did not stop there. The FBI also uncovered evidence that maybe he was both using and selling illegal substances. Now, in response to this activity, the FBI obtained a warrant and raided his home, searched his home. And when the agents searched the family home, they found that he had a handgun along with substances as well, drugs, I believe marijuana and cocaine. Mr. Hamani admitted that he did occasionally use substances and that those substances that were found at the home were his. And because of this, he was charged with violating 18 U.S.C. section 922G3, and he was indicted by a grand jury. Now, this federal law makes it a crime for anyone who is an unlawful user of controlled substances to possess a firearm. Now, in the district court, he filed a motion to dismiss the charges, arguing that under the Second Amendment and after Bruin and Rahimi, the Second Amendment does not allow a blanket ban like section 922G3. The trial court judge actually agreed with Mr. Hamani and dismissed the indictment. Now, on appeal, the Fifth Circuit affirmed that dismissal as well and ruled in favor of Mr. Hamani based on the Second Amendment. The Fifth Circuit based its ruling primarily on some of the other prior precedents that they had in the Fifth Circuit, where the courts had already held that it's unconstitutional to apply section 922G3 to someone who was simply a regular drug user or user of substances, but sober at the time that they possessed the firearm. The Fifth Circuit's primary ruling in this case was that the federal law only attaches and should only apply and be consistent with the history and tradition of our nation if the federal government can show that the person was presently intoxicated at the time that they had the firearm. So simply just occasionally using them or maybe having them was not enough. You had to show that the individual was intoxicated at the time. That left the DOJ really with one option, and that was to go to the Supreme Court. And in June of 2025, they filed a petition for Supreme Court cert, and that was granted by the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court has granted review to this case, and it will be ruled on this term. So what does the DOJ argue in this case, and what do they say the Supreme Court should ultimately find in this issue? First, they argue that the history and tradition in our nation supports disarming people considered dangerous, including habitual drug users. They point to laws restricting guns from intoxicated individuals, the mentally ill, and other individuals as well. Second, they say that Section 922G3 is not a permanent ban on your right to keep and bear arms. They argue that if someone stops using these substances, then they get their rights back, and that's a reasonable and temporary restriction, and therefore not a lifetime ban. Third, they highlight a growing circuit split on this very issue, and they point to the fact that just last term, the Supreme Court addressed the prohibited person question, which was addressed in cases like Rahimi, and they say that that issue also applies in this case. Now, in their arguments, the DOJ rejects the whole Fifth Circuit rule that firearms possession may be prohibited only while a person is actively intoxicated. It argues that the historical vagrancy laws, civil commitment statutes, and surety regimes impose restrictions historically based on status and a pattern of behavior, not the moment by moment, impairment and situation based on how that person was acting or what they did in that moment. Therefore, they argue that the tradition supports disarming habitual users during sober intervals, not just the instant of intoxication. So they're saying just because you're sober at the time, if you use them periodically, you should also be prohibited from having firearms. I will state that the big issue with this case, in my opinion, once again, is the horrible plaintiff. Like the Rahimi case, we have a very bad plaintiff and bad facts in this case. And if anything, the plaintiff in this case maybe is even worse than the plaintiff in the Rahimi case. However, I do think that the Supreme Court here will try to do the same thing that they did in the Rahimi case. They will try to narrow their ruling as much as possible to make it a pro toy ruling and leave any loss or any negative ruling, isolated maybe to just as applied to Mr. Hamani and his specific facts. Now, the big concern with this case is that we may get some bad language like we did in the Rahimi decision, where lower courts will then take that language and argue things like the more nuanced approach in, future 2A cases. So that's one of the bad things also about when you have a bad plaintiff and bad facts. Sometimes you get language from the Supreme Court that is not necessarily good. Sometimes it's even dicta, but then lower courts attach to that, grab onto that and try to use it to uphold 2A restrictions. So the big question the Supreme Court will be considering and answering in this case is, does the Constitution protect only so-called law-abiding responsible citizens as defined by the federal government, or does it apply to all people unless there is clear proof of a danger? The U.S. versus Hamani case will force the Supreme Court to answer that very question, and the ruling won't just affect one man and one individual in Texas. It could set the boundaries of the Second Amendment going forward and really impact millions of Americans, who maybe have similar issues. This case will also apply the Bruin and Rahimi standard to this case, which would also further flush out, how does that need to operate? And we get more language also that impacts the 2A cause going forward. So now we will be watching this case very closely as it moves forward towards Supreme Court oral arguments this term. But in summary, the Supreme Court has granted review to another critical Second Amendment prohibited person case, which will be ruled on this term. And the Trump DOJ continues to push back against this, and they want the Supreme Court to uphold this federal law. So that's what's going on in this critical case. As we get more information, I will let you guys know. If you would like to support this channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. You can also check out one of the 2 videos here on the screen that the YouTube algorithm thinks that you will find helpful. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support. And don't forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.